Okay, so thank you so much to all of you for joining us this morning. Yes, last panel of the workshop. I'd actually like to start by saying a big thank you to Holly and Dominique and Joshua and CU Boulder and the Tsadra Foundation, Marcus, and all of the support staff that have been diligently videotaping and taking pictures as well. So big thank you to all of you from all of us. Been such an amazing workshop to see old friends, to meet new people, and to have all these conversations over the course of the weekend in all these different kinds of sessions. And I love how we've had these large sessions and also these smaller ones where we can have these intimate conversations. And it's just been such a well-rounded and rewarding workshop in so many ways. And so we want to take this panel to sort of take a step back and reflect on the translation process and to think through some of the things that have emerged during the workshop or just in our years as translators that we'd like to share and bring out to talk about. One of the wonderful ways that we can think about process. We, as a group, were thinking about how that part of our panel title, process, and talking about the translation process. One of the wonderful ways to do that is through storytelling. And Jules has this wonderful statement that he sent me to look at, and we talked about a little bit when we all met yesterday as a group. So I'm going to ask you, Jules, to start us off by sharing your story with us.
You've got one.
Oh, wait. Forgive me, but that light is really bright, so. So good morning, everyone, and thanks very much for being here. Over the years, I've discovered that I tend to get distracted very easily, so if I write something down, I'm more likely to stay with what I'm trying to say. So that's what I've done. So if I could just look at you and say this spontaneously, I would. So please pretend that that's what I'm doing. Okay. As I thought about what I could contribute to this morning's conversation, some broad and general ideas came into view. The longer I nursed them, the more bloated they became. Late on Saturday night, something simpler and more particular tugged at me. Two things, really: oral translation and American literature. In the fall of 1985, Trungpa Rinpoche came to Boulder, and because no one else in town could hope to translate for him, I was asked to do so. Well, I was nowhere near ready to do that, but it was me or nobody. So I did the best I could, not particularly well. Still, it was a start. And from then until now, I've often served as an oral translator for a small handful of teachers whom I've come to know well over a fairly long period of time. Some have grown old, some have passed away. These days, I translate for their students. Sitting in that very hot seat, for a long time, I labored mightily to replicate in English every word of the Tibetan and every twist of the complex syntax. But a few years later, in the summer of 1991, I found myself translating for Ken Rinpoche Tsulchim Gyamtso at the Rocky Mountain Dharma Center. He had embarked upon an extended inquiry into the meaning of the two truths in 7 different contexts. I did my best to run after him and convey some of what he generated in a scorching and ever more terrifying, if nonetheless delightful, dismantling of the mechanisms of deception. One afternoon, looking up at him with a little less fear than usual, in a moment of uncomplicated pleasure, I relaxed into his voice, his manner, his eloquence. The depth of his humanity, the authority in his words, and my own trust in his accomplishment, lineage, and counsel. Whether then or later, I don't remember, but at some point it dawned upon me that were I not to convey the reality of those qualities and their beauty, I would fail to do the most important thing, no matter how many facts and syllogisms I got right. But that's asking a lot. I cannot really do it. What I can do is to tell the story I hear without worrying overly much about reproducing the Tibetan as if in a translation mirror. If I am to retell the story, then I will need to listen without resistance, hesitation, or anticipation. I have to disarm unilaterally. I have to sit still in the middle of my own fear and let the wind blow through me. I've no idea what the teacher will say next, and I'd better not make any plans. I will not be able to rewind the tape or reconsider the meaning before I speak. I will just have to say what I can reconstruct from notes scribbled hastily in bad Kyuyik, most of which I cannot read. And whatever else I remember, or think I remember, because if it sounds like the Buddha Dharma, I will probably just say it without looking back. I don't translate for people who already understood what the Lama said. I translate for those who didn't. And whether I like it or not, the story I tell is the one they hear. I'd better tell a good one, reliving it as I speak. Devotion to the story and to telling it well has grown stronger as my wife, Jessie, and I have become wedded not only to each other, but to the Jaipur Literature Festival that began in Rajasthan 11 or 12 years ago, and that in recent years has taken flight and landed in Colorado, London, New York, Houston, Australia, next year Toronto. The telling of stories in the way we do there enables us to find our humanity and to nourish it. Anne Klein told just such a story last Thursday night at Naropa University, beautifully, powerfully. It would be hard to forget. What could be more important than that? When you begin to look at Buddhist literature in this way, you see stories everywhere, even in, for instance, as I once did, the dry skeleton of a presentation of Salam, Grounds and Paths, where you start thinking that you're looking at a blueprint that, when it is touched by the imagination, spawns great novels, heroic poems, both lyric and epic. At the Literature Festival, here and in Jaipur, it is the storytellers who enchant and move the listeners, not the purveyors of fact and truth. The difference comes in the how rather than in the what, in understanding that you're telling a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. In December of 2017, Bill Murray came to Denver with 3 friends, Jan Vogler on cello, Mira Wong on violin, and Vanessa Perez on piano. Bill read from James Fenimore Cooper, Walt Whitman, Mark Twain, Ernest Hemingway, and a few others. His friends played Antonin Dvorak, Johann Sebastian Bach, George Gershwin, and West Side Story. Bill danced a waltz with the pianist. The evening ended. Jessie and I drove home from, as it seemed, a cafe where people unfold their hopes, tell their tales, and on a clear day, see part way into forever. We came away encouraged by what has been written here, by its sincerity, its rough-hewn power, and far-reaching, unquenchable longings. I like very much the notion of contributing to American literature, because rummaging through the literature of Tibet, telling their tales in our language, in time, we find to our surprise an American river running through those Tibetan lines. Then we make a home for them, among the prairies, forests, rolling hills, fertile valleys, rock mountains, and waterways of this land, somewhere among the many stories that have been told already, and the many that will be told in the days to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that beautiful statement. There is so much in there that we could talk about. And one of the things I'm interested, that really struck me with that is the opening up that we do when we translate to the speaker or the text that we are translating for. And when we do that and we notice what is happening in that process, that we may notice fear, and then somewhere in there that may come that relaxing into the process. And I was reminded actually, Lama Jabb, of your keynote lecture when you likened translation, the translation process to the bardo. And I just wonder if you see any resonance there. And also, I don't know if you had in mind, translating from a piece of writing, whereas, Jules' story is about translating orally, but I think, Jules, as you were saying to me as well, you think about it in terms of translating from a piece of writing. So I wonder if we could just open that up and talk about some of that process and what opens up, and the feelings and emotions you may encounter, and whether we need to then try to relax into it. I think that listening to the story, I'm struck by how it takes courage to relax, and we might not usually put those words together, but courage to face that fear and then relax into the translation process. So I invite anyone on the panel to respond to Jules' amazing statement.
Yes, thank you very much. That was really beautiful. I totally agree with, there's even translating a text like what we were talking yesterday about linguistic hospitality, and we're talking about actually there's kind of like a process of depersonalization that goes into it. And we also used Janet Janso, and I was saying, Nyangji Chenpo, a great compassion is needed, where that your translation process really transcends maybe the personhood. It's still agency is there, and I think you're touching on that point. And I just would like to, firstly, I would like to make a few clarifications. In my keynote, when I spoke about something is being lost in translation, I kind of highlighted these parts where all the translations, whatever translations, or every translation has something that is lost or uncaptured. I was highlighting this part, but I was sort of taking the rewards of translation for granted, so don't dishearten yourself. We gain, I think all of you know, we gain much, much, much more than we lose, or we couldn't convey. As you can see, this kind of this workshop, it's been quite hard, and it's quite been arduous, kind of maybe tiring, I'm sure. But also, I mean, in my keynote I didn't mention it, but translation is also a part of. I mean, it's very pleasurable. It's a delight. It's a form of pleasure, really. I mean, I didn't emphasize that because I thought we're all Lotsawas, and I just took that for granted. I'll just make that. And we are trying to find and transport wisdom. In a way, translators are techtons, treasure revealers. So we're not always losing or not finding things, please. That I just would like to make that clear. And then I thought once, I know my name is Lama, but I'm not a Lama. I hate giving advice and and telling people what to do. I hate that kind of stuff, because all the Tibetan Lamas and Geishis and people do that. They've been doing that for 1,000 years, and they still do it. So I leave that kind of duty to them. But I would, let me say this. I think when we translate a text, or even simultaneous translation, I think we need to kind of immerse ourselves within the text. Almost let the text take you over, like you're going into a trance. It's like Nichung. You get possessed by this deity. So I think we need to, I mean, that's what I try to do. I try to kind of immerse myself within a text. And then within that text, it's not just that text, then we try to go beyond the text, that sort of intertextual, that spindle dimensions of a text. Go beyond the text, go into history, go into culture, go into terrain, environment, snow mountains, noje, the container and the contained. And I think then we get hopefully a kind of a fuller understanding of the text and be able to transport the richness or the wisdom, or maybe reveal some of the wisdom sort of hidden or embedded or pervaded, immersed sort of within that text. That's,
yeah, you've given us many more metaphors to think about and digest. That's wonderful. Would anyone else on the panel like to join in or respond to anything that?
Sure. I'm interested in the. I was just saying to John before we started that the term imposter syndrome has come up again and again and again this weekend from our most esteemed colleagues who I'm sitting here with, to the graduate students who, by the way, I also wanted to say I've been so excited and moved by just the sheer kind of the diversity of skills and the diversity of skill level, and the kind of, I feel like I'm surrounded by genius. It's been such an incredible pleasure, from really from every, level. But again, I keep hearing this thing, imposter syndrome, and I think those of us who are on the academic side think it's part of academic training, that we become we feel like imposters or frauds, and that we take it for granted. We all know that we feel that way. But then to hear from these luminaries of translation that they also feel like imposters. I'm sort of fascinated by this, and I think it really goes to your point about fear and what we do when we translate, and how maybe appropriately terrifying it is. And also, Annabella Pitkin and I were talking a little bit about this, and she brought up the possibility that maybe translation is properly being an imposter in some sense, sort of willingly being an imposter, and that perhaps maybe embracing that. Or it's been interesting that everyone's been so willing to voice this, right? I think it's a nice reflection of how comfortable everyone is together. But I guess I'm just curious about that fear factor and the willingness to face and to also reveal oneself as feeling like feeling inadequate, or feeling perhaps like a fraud, even with all these years of experience and incredible skill level that I see all around me. So I guess I just wanted to highlight that, and also thank everyone for being willing to say that, because I think it really, there's a generosity in that kind of vulnerability that I think is among the many great things we've all gained together this weekend.
Well, I'd like to say, as one of the main imposters here, that I think it's actually been really interesting, and I'd like to pick up several things from, for example, from yesterday's breakout group on rasa theory. The range of human feelings that have the power to move us all from one state to another, as I think in one way what rasa theory seems to be getting at. And of course, terror is one of those. And I think, it's important to acknowledge one's terror, faced with the task of even translating something fairly simple, and this fear of betrayal, that we sort of continually have to face in bringing a text or a teaching over from one culture, one language to another that's so different. And of course there are other very strong feelings, and we've talked quite a lot in different sessions about devotion, and of course compassion. Devotion is really difficult, isn't it? I mean, I think some people are really good at feeling spontaneously devoted, and it's a skill. I think one of the things that struck me most when I first met Tibetan teachers, or Tibetans as a whole, and the Dharma, was that even feelings and let alone, of course, understanding and wisdom and everything, are things which are not necessarily just spontaneously there, but are to be cultivated and can be cultivated. And there are all kinds of ways of getting them up there in your mind and your heart, and looking into them and generating them more and more. But devotion is a very hard one. And I would like to talk a little bit about a simpler version, which I think is another sort of extension of the range of feelings, and that's simply appreciation and respect. And I think it's really important to try, when approaching a new text, to try to get into it and really feel what is being said and generate that appreciation. And in a way that connects with the whole extraordinary fact that we are dealing with a living tradition that is so incredibly ancient and profound. And to appreciate that seems to be the starting point. And I'd just like to bring this up and share with you this very interesting episode from the life of the Buddha that I recently heard about. And that is that after his enlightenment, there's these stories which are in most of the main biographies about how he hesitated whether it was possible even to express the ineffable that he felt he'd discovered. And of course, the usual biographies say that Brahma was aware of this and came to encourage him to do it, because he saw that if he didn't, the Dharma would be lost. But there's a very interesting twist that comes up in one of the Pali suttas, I think, called the Uruvela. I'm not sure if it's part of the Pali canon or if it's something slightly aside, where the Buddha, after his enlightenment, he feels that before he even begins to think about expressing it, it wouldn't be right not to feel appreciation and to pay respect to somebody or something. And he doesn't know what that should be, because his first instinct is to, again, this gets mixed up with the story about who he should first teach, but his first instinct is to think of his own teachers. And he thinks of, I think it's Rudraka, and the other one whose name escapes me just at this moment, who were his sort of, among the various teachers that he studied with, were among the best. And he can see with his newly found supernatural powers that in fact they both have quite recently died. So that's not an option. And he comes up with the idea that and he can see also that in this whole trichiliocosm, there's nobody who has actually attained the same realization as he has, and this is not something. This is obviously not an expression of pride or anything. It's just a bare fact, and so he decides that what he can express and feel respect and devotion, I suppose, but especially appreciation for, is the Dharma, which is very interesting because it puts the Dharma into a kind of to a level which is beyond Buddhahood, even, as if it's kind of the sort of perennially existing truth. And so this is, I find this is a very interesting story. It actually found its way as well into Sanskrit, and I was reading about it in an article about a fragment that was recently identified in the Gilgit collections, where there's a fragment of some of the verses that Brahma said to him when they had this dialogue about this expression of appreciation. And I think it's somewhere in one of the Prajnaparamita sutras as well, the Nichi. So, personally, I find that a very inspiring starting point to reflect. You know, that we, of course, need appreciation and respect as a kind of opening of the mind and the heart to what we're doing. But even the Buddha, you know, seemed to need that, and that to me is extremely intriguing. So I just thought I would share that as a yes, where we begin to approach not just thinking, okay, what am I going to do? How do I do this word? How do I do that word? How do I put this over?
Thank you so much. Sarah, are you ready to join us?
Sorry, my ears don't seem to be big enough. Well, as the other imposter on the panel, I feel like I need to say something about that. Surely at first it was, the first level of it is not having the proper academic credentials among all of you who do. But secondly, I think, you know, it's such an incredibly difficult thing. And especially some of our workshops, I want to say I'm in awe of people who are trying to translate these poems. And I want to just add really quickly, I really appreciate this conference and the planning for it, and Holly for having a focus. It makes it so interesting to have a specific focus instead of being all over the place, you know. And even with a focus, there's still so much to do. But I wouldn't dare to try and translate. I feel even more as an imposter now, because I'm very impressed with everybody's attempts at poetry. I'm definitely not a poet. And so since the precedent has been set for personal anecdote, whether of the Buddha or Jules, I have one. And also, you know, I heard from a psychologist once that if everybody is kind of over on one side in this given room of people, there's always one or two people who feel like they need to balance it out on the other side. That might be me. So I really have appreciated when I was growing up the lyrics of Bob Dylan. You know, I thought really profound and meaningful, not so much like other lyrics of the time. Not so much the "I love you," yeah. But yeah, and so then I did a 3-year retreat, and we were not supposed to read, and except for Tibetan commentaries of the particular practices, and even that after a year, not. So no literature, but somehow a few books found their way under the gate, and one of them was the Doonesbury cartoon collection. And I take it as literature. And for a number of reasons. One, obviously, because there was nothing else to do. And secondly, maybe I have to admit that the little teeny 1-inch square photograph of Gary Trudeau, I thought was probably the most beautiful man in the world from inside, locked up. But really, that was my only kind of access to what was going on in the world. So my entire impression of the world events was from this comic strip. I don't know if you've even seen Doonesbury. Actually, I saw he just came out with a new book called #Sad. But anyway, in that there was a president called, Jimmy Carter, and which I sort of totally missed that era. And I guess he gave or had some kind of like honoring of Bob Dylan. I don't know if this even really happened, but that was, and in that, you know, going on, they like to call Bob Dylan a poet, even though he's a lyricist and a composer, just because, you know, because it seems profound or maybe even obscure. But, and so there's this whole, you know, strip where that happens, and then at the end, afterwards, Bob Dylan says, or Gary Trudeau's Bob Dylan says, "Hey man, I was just trying to rhyme it." And you know, that's horribly true, I realized. The fall of my first hero. And I sort of feel like that's what I do. I just feel lucky if I come out, you know, I can barely understand what it says. Against all odds, I think maybe I've understood it. I try and digest it and mix it with my own experience and figure out what, and then try and spit out some kind of basic English that's readable, and as we've been talking about for years now, you know, kindness to the reader. So, you know, that's all I really try and do. I think it's really important to have it be a good read. And so I personally just wouldn't even, I can't mess with the poetry. So I really am in awe of you who do that. So thank you.
Sarah, thank you. So we have appreciation for Gary Trudeau, appreciation for Doonesbury, appreciation for the Dharma, appreciation for our teachers' qualities. And Sarah, you've talked a little bit about turning that appreciation into a translation, something that you feel is something good that you can share with others. I'd like to get a little more into that process of how do you turn, you know, spit out those words that sound decent in English. How do we do that? And Dominique, I know one of the other things we've been talking about is form and your interest in that. And I don't know if, you know, you want to talk a little bit about the process of that and what you think about, you know, when you think about form in translation, if you'd be willing to do that, or if anyone else would. Yeah, go ahead.
Sure, I'll start very briefly because I really want to hear what their process is. But I've been thinking a lot about form, it's true, and in its broadest sense. And I think, you know, in the process, I think one of the nice things about talking with all of you is getting into the nuts and bolts, is sitting in the room and seeing how people deal with the Tibetan that we may or may not understand, and some of us really understand. And, I guess in some sense I've like built in another layer to my process, you know, which starts with sort of basically being attracted to some piece of Tibetan and then trying to figure out what it is, and then making my best effort to just understand the meaning, to convey that meaning in a most literal way that I can, and then really trying to understand its literary qualities. And that next step of kind of going back to the Tibetan, and I mean, I'm really getting into things like syllable counting, and I've been so inspired by Lama Jabb's like demonstration of how these meters really work. But things like repetition or alliteration or rhyme, I have a very strong suspicion that these are not extraneous by any means, and that they, you know, if we can, all of you that have done these, that have workshopped your material, and we're so brave to experiment. You know, we asked everyone to do an experimental translation, and I think very often those were the ones where people maybe felt they let go a little bit, or played with the form a bit more, played with the words on the page, played with repetition or rhyme, or trying to maybe not reproduce the meter, but do something with line length, even if nothing else. And I guess I'm a very, you know, early career person, but I have this very strong commitment to the fact that will benefit the reader because of the joy that comes through this kind of virtuosity, right? Because very often what we really respond to in the Tibetan is some kind of like formal virtuosity. I'm not saying we can do that perfectly in the English, but I hope that everyone will maybe start to play with experimentation a bit more if you have the time, you know, if you're not pressed with a deadline, and you can do your translation and then see what happens if you play a bit more with some of these formal aspects. To me, I put a lot of hope in that possibility.
And sometimes it feels like challenge enough just to get the literal meaning and content. But I think we're all talking about something more and wanting to convey something more in our translations, whether that's form or that appreciation and how that might be conveyed, or whatever it is that we're trying to do.
Obviously, we all kind of differ from each other, and I am, being my mother tongue is Tibetan, so I think my approach and my experience might be very different, I think. But what I do is usually, I sort of had said already in the breakup sessions, that I translate something that compels me, that a poem that I really like, really like, and then I mean, it sounds like, I'm getting really spiritual, but I kind of like almost see myself translating a poem or a text that I read. I can just feel it, so kind of like love at first sight kind of thing. And then what I do is, I think, is this the kind of oral and aural kind of a dimension of poetry or a text, that I really read it. I read it out aloud, really several times read it aloud. And then obviously you kind of subject it to close reading, you deconstruct it and everything. But when I translate, I also read the English out loud to see how it differs, how the sound differs, how the rhythm differs from the Tibetan. So I think my own English, at a subconscious level, I think the way I write, my style of English, is definitely influenced by Tibetan. So what I read in Tibetan, and being Tibetan, and my kind of a nomadic upbringing and everything, I mean, I can't explain it to you, but it has definitely influenced my English style. So I think that itself is kind of like maybe a translation of form or something. But one of the things I do is I really read both the translation and the original again and again, quite loud, out loud.
Yes, I think, what I would like to think I do is that I kind of go through a text and try and make at least a draft of the main meaning that as it comes to me, and then go back and sort of refine it. But I also aware that sometimes when you very first read a phrase, you get an impact that is kind of a little bit surprising or spontaneous, or it's really that sort of first sight of those words or that passage, which is important to keep, to note at least, because even if later on you're going to come and refine it, there's something about that first impression that is sort of fresh and not to be discarded. But I think also another thing I wanted to bring up is what do you do when you don't appreciate what you're supposed to be translating? And this does happen, I don't want to be too Google-eyed about the translation process. Sometimes there are some not very well written passages, and sometimes there are some content which frankly is you think, this is going to be difficult for people to take in. And as an example, we had a recent sutra which is not yet published. I think we won't be in a great hurry. Which is really highly misogynistic, to be frank. As many sutras have these elements, as we discussed yesterday. And of course, one can put it into context. There's the problems that women in the 1,000, 2,000 years ago might have had in trying to have the time to practice. But this particular sutra was one of the worst. It exposes this what we call the gynecological worm theory of desire, which is that, and I think this wasn't necessarily a Buddhist invention. I think it also came from Ayurvedic theory, but I'm not quite sure. But the idea was that women's sexual desire came from the fact that they had parasites eating at their genitals, and the desire was the desire to relieve this awful itch that they caused, which is frankly, not going to go very far in today's world. And yet it's considered Buddha Vachana, or it has been considered Buddha Vachana. Of course, we can't change what the text says. I couldn't think of any wonderful way of rephrasing it or picking up something which might mollify slightly the sentiment. You just have to kind of see what function it might have led for some particularly impervious monks or something who were absolutely... But of course it's part of this whole thing about viewing the disgusting nature of the body as an antidote to desire, and I guess nobody would ever take it as a definitive statement of any kind. And the only thing one can do is contrast it with... For me, this happened at about seeing this text happened at about the same time as we were working on the Chanda Maharoshana Tantra, which is the most glorious. It's completely the opposite, the absolute exploration of the delights and joys of women and how important they are and how, in fact, they're to be worshipped. Well, very explicitly, let's say. I don't know if you've seen the Tantra. But, so I think all we can do as translators in that kind of situation is we have to be frank about it. This is what the text says. We can't change it. It needs to be contextualized. Thank goodness, we have the opportunity of putting a little introduction where we can say, well, this is there in the collection, and we can't make it go away, but it had a particular context, and it's obvious, I don't think the reader would need any warning that it's not perhaps to be taken as the only ultimate gospel truth. But this happens, and Heidi was talking yesterday about perhaps not a whole text, which she didn't really want to translate, but certain elements for which there were constraints about what could be done. And I think that's a very difficult situation. It's very hard to translate something and to publish something and to put a lot of effort into something that you don't really quite agree with.
Well, I think I better not describe my process lest someone take it as advice. But I can only say it involves many trips to the coffee shop.
I think people mentioned already several times how important to read novels, read outside the text, read different. This is again my kind of point of extra text, that kind of intertextual dimensions, dealing with the dimdal aspects of a text. My kind of process, one thing that I do is actually I have kind of lots of English literary books on my desk. I have got like Oxford Book of British English essays, or an anthology of Irish poetry, or things like that, which I always read, because when you get bored, you just read those and it wakes you up. But for instance, before I kind of start translation or anything, I always read a poem, a great poem, or a piece of, or an essay, or a paragraph or two from a really famous essay, and things like that really helps me to kind of inspires me to write in English.
So, yes.
Sarah, I loved what you said about in the breakout group about how you, your Uncontrived Elegance breakout group, how you send your students to coffee shops all over Boulder to express the text that they're translating in clear English. So I got this image of your students out spreading the Dharma in all the coffee shops in this very clear, simple English. You know, it's an interesting part of the process.
If you can't say it in English, you didn't understand it. That's my feeling.
Yeah.
So we're coming up close to about 10 o'clock, and I think it would be good if we could open it up. I'm sure that there are lots of questions or comments, or even just your own thoughts and suggestions about aspects of the translation process in your experience. So I think, we'll open it, open the floor if anyone would like to start us off with questions. If not, we're happy to continue talking up here. Oh, yeah, I think.
Hello? This is more just a comment than a question about the imposter syndrome discussion that happened. It struck me that, we read a lot of colophons where the Tibetan author is saying, I don't know anything, and I'm just like a poor schlub from the mountains who doesn't know anything about anything, and then will go on to deliver this beautiful treatise, right? I always thought that was just a rhetorical, cultural kind of self-effacement or something like that. It's just you had to be diminutive in the colophon, so you don't put yourself forward as a great scholar, and that they were just kind of putting that on. Now I kind of wonder if they were actually being completely honest about what they thought about themselves. So.
Yeah, that's very intriguing. I think it's probably a bit of both. There's a need for self-effacement. It's healthy, but at the same time, it'd be nice to think that everybody shared it.
Again, just very particular things tend to come to me, and I can't speak to the question in a general way, but as you were speaking, Adam, I just remembered quite vividly that whenever I see something that one of the teachers I've worked with a lot, Changpa Rinpoche, whenever I see anything of his, at the end in the colophon it always says Changu Trulming Jengi, the one who has the name of. And to me, he's the Buddha in person. But I think he means it. He's just saying, well, Karmapa gave me this name, and so here I am. And as I've wondered about it, and sometimes traveled with him, I've seen that however I may look at him, he's thinking of himself in relationship to his teachers and the people who have come before him. And he's thinking, yeah, I suppose compared to knowing, I don't know what, but it's just like if you're inheriting the lineage of, from Nagarjuna and Telopa and Milarepa, and you were close with the Rangchen Rigpa Dorje, you just don't have that high an opinion of yourself. I think that's a big part of it. I can't say anything about the others, but just that one man, I don't think he's kidding, honestly.
It's fun when you're translating them too. Sometimes the extreme ones, how far do you go to, be insulting?
I wonder, isn't there this temptation sometimes as a translator in the face of that, a magnificent Shastra or something, to want to be invisible, despite the impossibility of that, and maybe even dishonesty of that, of sort of pretending or presuming that you can be invisible somehow.
Yeah. It's a big conceit. Sort of a conceit to think you can be invisible, But I also, same Lama Rinpoche translating for him once, and he said all those kind of things. And then there were people, someone believed him and was like, well, if you don't have any realization, why are you doing There's always that problem. Or maybe Adam is experiencing it.
It just reminds me yesterday morning of the panel and talking about how, you know, we have no control as translators or speakers of any kind of how anything will be interpreted, and there are things that we can do to try to, I don't know, fill in some context, but ultimately, that's one of the other things that I've been thinking about also since some of the comments at yesterday morning's panels and over the course of the workshop are thinking about our audiences. And, you know, in our workshop, I think one of the scenarios was, well, you know, are you translating, say, for people who have a literary appreciation of English, in which case you might end up with a certain kind of translation, or for a broad audience, a global audience for whom, you know, many readers may not have English as their first or even second language, and, you know, how your translations may look quite differently depending on that, and whether it's really possible to try to balance in between those different sorts of readers that you might have, you know, even let alone other issues of interpretation of the cultural and religious context.
I think I can talk pretty loudly.
Yeah.
You should.
Yes.
I don't know if it's for the recording.
It's for TV.
Posterity. My question is focused to Jules, but then also more broadly. Thank you so much for reading about storytelling. So beautiful, so compelling. And I find myself wondering, just in the midst of our entire conversation this weekend in the workshop, about the interaction between storytelling and form, literary form. And I think in the West we might be most accustomed to hearing stories in prose, but we've been exploring gore and nyingak and verse. And so I think I'm just wondering about how we can use the potency of storytelling and sort of letting the barriers down, letting something move through you, telling your story, but then doing it in different kinds of form, and how those different forms might inflect the way that you tell that story, or even the story that you think is worth telling.
Does that mean I should say something first? I just spent 2 wonderful afternoons with a group of people working hard at some songs, you know, by Khenpo Kansha Wangpo and Jigme Lingpa, and one by Chögyam Trungpa, and even a beautiful piece by Chandrakirti. And we really beat ourselves to death trying to turn these things inside out and whatever. But I kept waiting for them to pick me up and just toss me over the balcony, you know, because I kept saying over and over and over that one of the things that won't leave me alone these days is just to let myself get a little crazy. And so, rather than, I mean, I think maybe a lot crazy, but just, I can't calculate out what the form's going to be, but that same thing of just letting the thing take me over. I mean, Lama Jabb was talking about, you know, being, you know, drawn into it, like you're the Nechung possessed. Yeah, I mean, this thing's going to haunt you. And what I find is if I can stay there, and I got really nuts with them yesterday, and I said, well, it's not that different to sit here and surrender to Jigme Lingpa's incredible, you know, naked exposure of himself to his teacher, you know, pleading into reality. between that and if I could be just crazy in this way, what I think I go through when I listen to John Coltrane or Cecil Taylor. I just have to completely give into it. And the funniest thing is, that's when something comes to me and I just try it out. I can't figure it out at all. And that's, I was looking back at this nutty thing I wrote about looking at a Tibetan line and finding an American river. But that's what I mean. I mean, it just comes out of nowhere. And I'll just try it. And maybe I end up liking it, and maybe at the end of the day I think, well, I got nothing done today. Throw it away. You know, hit the delete key and try again tomorrow. That's okay. That's work. So if we don't already have the form, maybe we'll find it, or maybe we'll invent a new one. But I think the only way I could ever do it is just to, you know, let the roof and the walls and everything else collapse and the ground dissolve under my feet and just see what comes out. Just, you know, and try. But at the same time, I don't think this, I mean, this may sound like a complete contradiction. I lived with a guy when I was an undergraduate who had spent his high school years writing a sonnet every day, a Shakespearean sonnet every day all through high school. And by the time I met him, he had learned a great many poetic forms, and he could write beautiful verse because he'd worked hard at the discipline of it, like learning the grammar of it, you know? And, you know, all speed ahead on all possible fronts and just try something. When, I think it was Lama Jabb was saying something a moment ago, but now I just remember what came up for me about it was, no, it was what Sarah was saying about Dylan. About I was just trying to make it rhyme, you know?
Just trying to make it rhyme.
Just trying. Yeah, suddenly I remembered this interview I'd heard with the American poet Robert Pinsky, who was a poet laureate. And I heard this thing about the time that he made a translation of Dante's Inferno. And he was being interviewed about it. He said, I'm just trying to make it sound good. I'm not even sure I understand it. You know? If it sounds good, then maybe I did my job okay. You know, and it's sort of like, beyond that, I'll just have to trust something bigger, you know? And we'll see what happens. Anyway.
Well, it's so interesting to hear people talk about sort of the rigor of translation and then the relaxation, you know, needed to let something flow through, and sort of interesting parallels to the Buddhist path there, especially sort of once you get to the spontaneous end of things. But I wanted to sort of circle back to form, because I sometimes think that we consider you know, form to be a kind of constraint that's opposed to creativity. And actually in our workshop, people who chose certain meters or certain registers, Natasha's amazing Tolkien-esque version of the Gesar epic with that meter and archaic language that she shared with us in song last night, you know, that there's something about choosing a form or choosing some kind of constraint that can actually unleash our creativity. And I also have to remember back to a moment with Dominique that was stunning at the AAR, a panel organized by Christy Kilby on letter writing. And there was this acrostic, right, by Terdak Lingpa. You know, each line starts kakaganga, etc. And she had done a really formal, literal translation of it that eschewed the form. And, you know, it was kind of heavy-handed and took a lot to slog through, but you could tell there was erudite stuff in it. And, you know, and it was like, and then we had this conversation on the phone, or no, we were Skyping, and I kind of begged her, can you make it an acrostic? You know, can you go A, B, C, D, E? And And when she recited that at the AR panel, and the AR is not like this, it doesn't have the same, everybody's not so warm and fuzzy and cheering all the time, but I swear that group in that room, it was electric. And people just burst out into applause. And there's something about the effortlessness, I think you described, I don't know if you want to say anything about it, but of surrendering to the form.
Yes. That's it. Yes. No, I actually find form very helpful. I feel like without it, I don't know. I also write poetry, but I think I partly am sort of developing in this way, again, as a very early in my process of learning to translate really still. Because I find it so supportive, and actually liberating, right? Once I know that the form is there, then I can relax a bit with these other things about diction. And of course, I think one thing that we all share, which is why we're even having these conversations, is we're all so deeply committed to the content, right? So I think again, like that, we've all taken for granted that we're like, tearing ourselves apart, trying to make sure we really understand the Tibetan, and many of us, work with Tibetan interlocutors or lamas, and so again, I think that's why we're kind of able to take that as a starting point. But yes, I find some kind of formal constraint very freeing myself. Yeah.
I was in that room when you recited your acrostic poem at AAR, and yes, it was electric and everyone applauded, and there was just this feeling of, why can't we have more of this at AAR? Why can't we have more of this? And in fact, since then, I think there has been a flowering of interest in, at least among people in presenting in Tibetan and Himalayan studies at AAR in the literary.
Lama Jabb, since your keynote speech, you mentioned the idea of doing violence to the text and Tibetan culture, and I can't stop thinking about that. And so I'm wondering if you or anybody else has some advice about when choosing a text, specifically how important it is to seek permission from someone in the tradition or some other source before you start.
Systemic violence. I meant it in a, of course, what Walter Benjamin kind of intimates, that translation is a form of survival. And it definitely is a form of survival. It also contributes to the survival of the Tibetan language and Tibetan culture. So there's that kind of element as well. It's almost, I'm saying something contradictory. But when the translation is too transparent, fluent and transparent and smooth, and as if it's written in English, without any trace, or even the faintest traces of the Tibetan original, then I think there is a danger of maybe Tibetan cultural and linguistic invisibility. I said that's one thing. Another thing that I was taking issue with, I really didn't go into it, and some of the statements that I made in my keynote speech are just there to maybe disturb people a little bit, as Foucault says, ethics of discomfort. You may not agree with it, but it implants something in your head, and we start thinking about it. But one thing is that one thing that I'm really worried about is the naming of Tibetan names and Tibetan place names and things inside Tibet, for instance, where all the names are now synthesized, and like, for instance, Repkong is Tongren or something. Labrang, this great monastic town center, is Xiahe, or maybe Lablang or something. Or Dashi is Dashi Tailang or something. So I'm just looking at all this kind of, when you replace or don't pay attention, or either translate people's name or totally kind of erase the traces of the Tibetan kind of identity or history or anything enmeshed with it. I think we have a bit of a problem. That's why I kind of quoted the translation, Friar Braille's famous play translation, where the 19th century, the British imperial authorities started translating Irish place names and giving English names or anglicizing the place names, and then you really lose the folk mythic memory associated with places and culture and things like that. So I'm sort of worried about things like that, and I'm also a bit worried about when we translate. It depends again what you're translating as a text, what text you're translating, and of course if you can get a Tibetan advisor and Tibetan authority on this text, it's very, very important. That's what actually Lauren Hartley and we were talking about this, where maybe we should come up with a system or a medium or some kind of online forum or maybe even institutional existence which provides collaborations or between Tibetan language speaking translator and the English or French language speaking translators. Pair them together and let them work together, help each other. And this kind of a workshop it's been unbelievably fruitful and everything, and our concentration has been translation from Tibetan into English. So what can we do from English or from other foreign languages into Tibetan, the translation? What can we provide? I think that's, so maybe we could just, I don't want to use that metaphor, yeah, but maybe we could do both, and then that would help, I think. Yeah. But I think in terms, if it's a religious text, then you might need long or transmission or things like that, which is, I think a good thing, because that's like a form of permission you get, but also it puts you in this cultural context and cultural mood, that what I was talking about, this kind of temporal dimensions of a text, and puts you into the mood. And I think it's important. And I'm not saying that every translation is a form of violence.
I had one or two things more I wanted to say,
Yes,
but I can wait.
So this might be really boring and maybe completely useless. But I was thinking, sometimes when I even just trying to translate really simple terminology like bodhicitta, people are like, it's the enlightenment mind. And they're like, no, it's the awakening mind, because body means like awakening. And then, jumping between academic translations or like translating for different groups, we're constantly trying to think about the terminologies we use, and it takes time. I don't know if it'd be useful or, less boring to actually start trying to compose like a collection of things that people agree on in terms of maybe just the main terminologies, like, getting people like you who are experienced and from different backgrounds to kind of sit down and discuss certain terminologies, which might be so boring, but it seems maybe quite useful for the future. I'm not sure, because the Tibetans did this, the Mongolians did this, the Chinese did this, and they have sets, and it makes life a bit easier. I don't know.
I was at a graduate student seminar that the Mangalam Center sponsored in Berkeley in 2010, and there were 6 faculty teaching that seminar, and maybe about 16 or 20 graduate students, I don't remember exactly. But some people from the Mangalam Center said we were translating the Vimalakirti Nirdesha Sutra, but some people from the Mangalam side were also interested in developing a lexicon. In fact, I think they still have a lexicon project, but I just remember that moment with the sort of room full of scholars when they brought up the idea. Everyone just started shaking their heads immediately, said, we'll never agree on that. And we sort of, had working, I think, like my small group of graduate students, we developed a small shared document among ourselves, but among the group in general, it was sort of like this is something that's not, it wouldn't be a lexicon. There might be a resource that would be shared, but, the idea of getting scholars to agree on a translation for a term seemed, I don't know, like laughable to people in that room, like it will never happen. But I'm curious to see, what other experiences people may have had or what they'd like to say about that.
I think the most important thing in that line is to try to make it visible what people are using for a particular term and make it easier to see and compare, because if you're hunting for a particular term and you have to hunt through how different translators have tackled a particular term, and you have to hunt through 20 different whole book translations, that's very difficult. But if there were more online resources which allowed you to see for any particular term how they've been translated by a wide range of translators, it really helps to at least choose, or if you don't agree with any of them, to find something else. So it's in terms of encouraging innovation, that's also important. I think we're far too early, in a way, in the history of translation of Tibetan Buddhism to try and narrow down the choices. And I don't see any way of doing that, unless we go even further towards dictatorships and somehow we get, government-controlled translation bureaus, and maybe we'll all be forced to do that. I'm sure that in the sort of paradigm of the Imperial Tibetan Translation Project, I'm sure there were people who didn't agree with some of the choices, but they just had to lump it.
They were called Nyingmas, right?
That's right. So I think glossaries, and it's really important that people spend time making it visible what they've done and trying to disseminate that. For the 84,000 project, one of the important things that we hope will come out of it is a cumulative glossary, which is already taking shape, of as many terms as possible from all of the translations that we've published being just consultable, so that people can see what's been done and choose. But it would be obviously that's a particular corpus of literature which has its own specific needs, and I think there's a lot more that could be done in the wider body of Tibetan literature as a whole. But of course there are many such resources already, and of course Google is a great help.
Yeah, there's one or two things I feel I'd be remiss if I didn't say them. I'll try to be brief. First of all, I agree with John. But, so let's just do it that way. But then, Lama Jabb, you were just saying something about the erasure of names. And I was very struck because it was 2 weeks ago, 3, I forgot, the Jaipur Literature Festival here in Boulder that we've established. One of the most wonderful writers who came to it is a Kenyan. His name is Ngugi wa Thiong'o. I didn't really know much of anything about him until I took him to the hospital on Saturday morning and spent 5 or 6 hours with him trying to help him deal with whatever was paralyzing him so that he couldn't move, in the hope that he could come to the panel that afternoon. And but I had learned a little about him, and this fellow I'd never heard of, who's now 80 years old, I had come to understand was, at least in literature, if not in politics, someone we might think of as being of the stature of Nelson Mandela, and has been an enemy of the state, and has been imprisoned several times, and his own government has attempted to assassinate him. And because he started writing about not just the corruption in his state, but about the devastation that his land and his people had suffered through colonization and imperialism, beginning to write in the 50s and 60s as a young man. And one of the turning points for him, which we talked about during his session, was a time at which he had been writing in English But then he, at a certain point, stopped doing that and went back to Kikuyu, his native tongue, for his own writing. Now his books are then translated into many, many languages. But he was so moving as he spoke about what happens when you erase a people's language and everything that's lost with it. So I don't have anything to add to what you're saying, but just to echo it, and for some ideas perhaps about how to understand what's being done and how one might respond, looking at this man's life and his work, could shed some light on that. I had to work so hard just to get his name straight. The last name is Thiongo, Thiong apostrophe O. Wow. And if you look it up, you won't have any trouble. Google knows all about him. And the other thing is that I had wondered whether to say anything about this book that I found very helpful at a certain point, that I remembered as I was thinking about what I might say this morning. And then I decided not to go into it much. But as I was listening to you, in particular, Lama Jabb, speaking about, the sense of possession and reading it aloud and getting the sound of it, I thought, well, so a long time ago, Robert Bly, the American poet, published a book called The 8 Stages of Translation. It's only 70 or 80 pages long. It's out of print now, as best I can tell. And I found it tremendously helpful, and I realized it affected me very powerfully, not so much in what I actually do, but what I would like to do. But I think it has a lot of bearing upon the kind of thing we're considering at this gathering, because what he does is he shows you taking one of Rilke's sonnets to Orpheus, and he goes through it stage by stage. It's not in this essay, it's not the names of the stages, which frankly sound rather obvious and boring. That's not what's important. It's watching him as he takes his own process apart, beautifully and eloquently, in the way a great poet can, telling you what he suffered and the angel that he wrestled with as he came to some illumination and found Rilke's humanity and his own, and was able to put this into verse. It made a tremendous impact upon me, and I would just say, I don't know that it would answer anybody's questions, but it might help any number of us to think about how to work our way through and open up this process. You said a lot of what he says, which I thought, well, maybe it's worth mentioning. Because,
thank you.
Yeah, and anyway, keep going.
It's a very interesting point, isn't it? How do we retain something Tibetan in translations when we're trying to make them as fluent and easy to read as possible in English? And I think names is obviously one important thing. I mean, this is very, of course, the Tibetans did this to the Indians. They translated into Tibetan all of the names, the place names and the personal names, or large majority.
Translation is obviously a process that changes and transforms the language. Of course, it's going beyond Tibetan language. I, of course, acknowledge that. And I think the way, like, for instance, Tibetan translators translated Sanskrit and Pali texts, and how even now we pay homage to Indian language. Jagarkata, Umtata, Kate, Parangate, Parasamgata, so on, and then Workata, So we go. First, a text is started in Indian language. That is a respect. That's we're acknowledging the source. Maybe a source of devotion as well, but a source of, look, this is from India. There's this Indian language here. And suddenly when you read it, you feel that foreignization, that you are going into a different world. This is inside. So that kind of thing is, I think, one technique. And the other technique I'm mentioning is sometimes I came across, I can't remember the names of the books now, but some books that are translated from Tibetan into English, but I couldn't find any signs that is translated from Tibetan in the book, because usually Sanskrit terms are bracketed, but not the Tibetan terms. So I think if one is going to bracket Sanskrit term, then if Tibetans used it in the Tibetan source, please use Tibetan as well, so that you can see this text, this book is from Tibet. Maybe it's a retranslation, maybe it's translation of a translation, but still it came through the medium of the Tibetan language. So I think that's just like referencing, the way when we write critical essays, we reference. It's the same thing, referencing, but also a form of maybe paying homage to the Tibetan language, I think.
So I think because of the time, we'll maybe have to conclude the formal part of this panel, though of course you're welcome to continue conversations as we move to our tea break. But thank you so much to all of you for joining our discussion. Let's also please thank our panelists.